brings me, Mr President, to reflect on the significant impact in this budget that is being felt from delivering on responses to recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry into the Tasmanian Government's response to child sexual abuse in institutional settings. The extent of that is clearly stated in Budget Paper number 2, Volume 1, which identifies this as one of 4 key areas of focus for the budget. The Government's commitment to deliver all recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry has been widely welcomed, particularly those measures that address drivers of engagement in the child safety and criminal justice systems. Having said that, key stakeholders such as TASCOS have pointed out that most of the expenditure in this area focuses on tertiary interventions and responses to violence against children, rather than providing adequate investment in long-term preventative and early intervention measures that support family and wellbeing. This, coupled with the significant workforce challenges faced, particularly in the child safety system, risk undermining the achievement of the outcomes sought from the Commission's recommendations, that Tasmania's children are safe. A completed checklist of implemented recommendations in and of itself will not guarantee the actual outcomes to which we have all expressed commitment, the safety of Tasmania's children. The broader policy context within which these delivered recommendations sit, including the adequacy of investment in prevention and early intervention, coupled with the central, more tangible pillar of genuine culture change, will be determinative in achieving those outcomes. The additional funding of $423 million over 4 years to deliver on the recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry is detailed in the budget papers, and there has an extensive list that gives us an indication of the size of the job, which is in Budget Paper number 2, Volume 1, covering pages 30 to 39. Mr President, I'm not going to go into detail on each of the funded implementation program there that relates to the Commission of Inquiry. I can't, though, go through my contribution and not mention closure of Ashley Youth Detention Centre. And I express, again, because it should be given voice to at every opportunity, the intense concern and frustration and alarm that is held by so many, both the commissioners themselves when they pointed to this as a matter of urgency, by those in the community who are victim survivors of that place, by people who have been whistleblowers, who have actually pushed for change and know that the only way to resolve the risk of harm that's there is to close that centre. And many of us here in this place and in this parliament, it's highly concerning that we have an ever retreating date for the closure of Ashley Youth Detention Centre.
I don't think they're going to close it.
Mr President, it does prompt us to ask, is there a real possibility that this centre will not be closed? And I ask that because we know it was announced in 2021 by then Premier Gutwein to happen within 3 years, which would be about now. That hasn't happened. I understand circumstances have changed since then. What the original intention in closing it was to replace it with 2 similar facilities in the north and the south of the state. Plans have changed, informed appropriately by the Commission of Inquiry. We're now doing a redesign of our whole youth justice system to introduce a more comprehensive model. There's nothing wrong with that, Mr President, except that while it may be a reason that we need to take more time, I fear that it will also be a reason that we never arrive at that destination.
Exactly.
And the reason I think that and fear that is because I've observed this sector over many, many years, at least the last 15 years. In my work before this place and during my time in this place. And I have seen time and time again announcements made, reforms committed to, which have never come to fruition in this space. And across the time that those announcements were being made and those commitments were being put out there, we continued to have, behind closed doors in that institution, children being raped on a daily basis. We continued to have human rights abuses occurring on a daily basis. We continue to see children being assaulted. We continue to see workers in that place being bullied and at times driven out when they didn't comply with the culture of that place, which a DPAC commissioned expert report has now said as a closed institution was a culture of a pedophile ring within a closed culture. That is what has happened the whole time that this government, over a number of terms of government, have committed to making it better. And they had never done that. I was in the sector, Mr. President, when there were announcements of the introduction of therapeutic models into Ashley, and millions of dollars were poured into it. This goes back to 2014, 2015, 2016. Millions of dollars. Even though they were told at the time through the Noetic report they should close it,
That's right.
Instead announced a wonderful new therapeutic approach. It has resonance to the announcements now that we're going to be redesigning our youth justice system entirely and have this wonderful new approach, which on paper sounds great. Sounded great then too. Millions of dollars poured into Ashley. It stayed open. Children continued to be raped daily. That's what we now know from the Commission of Inquiry. While they poured in millions of dollars, while they delayed actually closing it as they'd been advised to do by the experts. So that's why I find myself here, Mr. President. When I hear these timelines continue to be pushed out, when I hear the commitment expressed to wonderful new therapeutic, trauma-informed approaches that are going to be introduced at some point, when I hear that, I have a high level of scepticism because there's kids in there still and the minister cannot stand up in public and say they are absolutely safe. At this moment, he can't. He cannot say that there aren't abuses happening right now. And that should be unacceptable to every single one of us in this place. Every single one of us. And the government is too complacent on this. They are too complacent to say we're doing it as soon as possible. We're getting there in the end. We've got all these task forces and these working groups developing this lovely new model. That is not enough. It is not enough for our public confidence that we are actually protecting children in that place. Children we are responsible for. So, Mr. President, we'll continue to speak on this matter in this place. And I'm incredibly pleased that the Parliament has established the Joint Committee to scrutinise the government's response to the Commission of Inquiry and that work is underway actively now. It's a committee that I am very pleased to be a member of, and it will be similarly challenged, I think. That committee will be similarly challenged to ensure that scrutiny is not limited to a checklist approach, but that it genuinely delves into assessing the progress of real, tangible change and delivering that overarching outcome that we all want to see achieved, that children are more safe here in our state. As well as delivering on recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry, I do note this budget contains substantial provision for payment of redress and civil claims. That's an area of responsibility, Mr. President, that, of course, we must meet. And I will hope that there will be appropriate support provided to claim recipients that may need assistance in managing their financial circumstances after receiving such payments. Mr. President, the saga of the Commission of Inquiry will continue, and there will be many of us who will maintain a fierce scrutiny of that progress. And again, I would like to acknowledge here, and I know the things I've spoken about today can be very triggering, and I want to plainly say that I acknowledge victim survivors in the Tasmanian community and whistleblowers who have contributed to exposing these horrific abuses as being champions for our state and champions for children in our state. And we cannot thank them enough, and we cannot acknowledge the bravery of victim survivors enough who have come forward to make clear what has happened and how we need to ensure it doesn't happen again. Mr. President, another key focus of this budget, identified in Budget Paper 2, Volume 1, is the provision of cost of living relief. This is an area in which we should expect priority attention to be given to measures that are equitable, inclusive and sustainable, and which make positive structural change for our future. At the post-budget briefing provided by TASCOS, it was highlighted the degree to which Tasmanians are suffering under cost of living pressures. In that briefing, they pointed to the cost of essentials, which have in reality surged more than CPI. They pointed out that 71% of Tasmanians receiving income support are cutting back on meat, fresh fruit and vegetables because they can't afford it. 51% of Tasmanians receiving income support are skipping meals regularly. 61% of Tasmanians overall say they are financially worse off than last year, and almost half have cut back on essentials to make ends meet. A telling statistic, Mr. President, is that 1 in 5 Tasmanians could not raise $500 in an emergency. Back in the day, we used to have $2,000 as a measure by which we looked at resilience. We used to say, could you raise $2,000 in an emergency? Now we're actually just putting the bar at $500. Could you raise $500 in an emergency? An emergency could be you need to replace the tyres on your car, or your fridge is broken down, or those sorts of things. 1 in 5 Tasmanians couldn't do that. That tells us clearly that too many Tasmanians are in a highly precarious position, one that cannot withstand any further pressure or unexpected shocks. The key cost of living pressures being experienced by Tasmanians are affordable housing, food security, electricity costs, transport, access and digital inclusion. On none of those fronts does this budget do enough in terms of structural improvements to address the current affordability issues and deliver real, enduring positive outcomes. Instead, we see a focus on short-term relief, such as poorly targeted one-off energy bill payments, which has seen, I believe, $12.7 million of financial support unnecessarily going to the wealthiest 20% of Tasmanian households, which probably includes most of us in this place. Unbelievable. While that might be quite a sugar hit for the government as an election announcement, it's very, very poor use of public money, Mr. President, and does nothing to provide enduring relief to those who need it most. It's $12.7 million, which could be providing funding for structural energy efficiency improvements for the lowest income Tasmanian households. That would have extended the beneficial impact far beyond a one-off handout to people who didn't need it, and would have made a tangible difference to cost of living for those households, not just in one bill cycle, but well into the future. And of course, we know that there is a cascade effect when you provide structural support in this way. For example, when a household isn't struggling so much to pay their energy bill in an enduring sense into the future, they are much less likely to have to ration food and skip meals or seek emergency food relief. They are much more likely to be able to meet their housing costs, pay their rent, and be at less risk of homelessness. Mr. President, it's a no-brainer. Structural improvements not only assist individual households, they decrease reliance on a range of other services and thereby save public expenditure overall in an enduring sense into the future. It's particularly true when the investment is well targeted to those people and households who are most in need. To opt for that sugar hit and the electoral boost of simplistic, non-targeted payments makes a mockery out of that trite rhetoric we so often hear from Liberals here in this place of how much they value a hand up, not a handout. What rubbish, Mr. President. What rubbish. Handouts is virtually all we've seen here when it comes to cost of living relief. Poorly targeted or not targeted at all handouts. Make a hand up next time, please, by all means. Live up to your trite rhetoric. Digital inclusion was another cost of living area named up by TASCOS, with our state languishing, with more than 1 in 4 Tasmanians reporting their phone and internet costs unaffordable. That's 140,000 Tasmanians digitally excluded and unable to access the benefits of the online world. And in this modern age, Mr. President, internet access is not a luxury, it's an essential utility. This budget is a virtual vacuum when it comes to addressing the fact that Tasmania is the most digitally disadvantaged state and scores the worst of any state or territory on digital ability. This is another one of those areas in which investment in structural improvements would deliver enormously beneficial outcomes, not just for individuals who are being assisted, but for the ultimate saving of public money and a boost to our economy that would come from meaningful improvements in our digital inclusion. People are much easier to employ if they're digitally capable, Mr. President, and they can access the digital world. People are much easier to keep in education and training if they're digitally capable, Mr. President, and able to access the digital world. It's our economy that's suffering when we fail to make long-term structural investment in these ways. On affordable housing, while long-term building projects are all well and good, not enough is being done to address the immediate crisis in the private rental market in particular, where there are a multitude of levers the government is refusing to consider, at the expense of those who are most vulnerable, often teetering on the edge of homelessness. Effective regulation of short-stay accommodation market with greater control at the local government level to ensure the private rental market doesn't continue to be gutted by property shifting into short-stay. I'll give you an example, Mr. President. Devonport has experienced a 40% increase in whole homes added to the short-stay sector in the last year. There is no way that hasn't had a crippling impact on the local private rental market and a negative flow-on effect then to employment, to education, to homelessness in that city. More definite and enforceable regulation of rental increases to ensure that we don't continue to see ballooning rents, such as the 38% increase in the median rents in only the last 5 years. These are all options which are available right now, which would make a difference right now and help turn off the pipeline of people into homelessness in this state. And yet this government refuses to do any of them. This government's plans, Mr. President, on housing and homelessness are demonstrably inadequate. Tasmania has experienced a 42% increase in social housing waitlist in 5 years. It's sitting now at 4,745 families. The average wait time for social housing has blown out to an average of 1.7 years, which is 35% longer than 5 years ago. We've had a 45% increase in homelessness in 5 years. That's 9 times the national average. Nothing in this budget is sufficient to change any of those trajectories, which tells us this government has no effective plan to solve our housing and homelessness challenges. No effective plan. Mr. President, Budget Paper number 2, Volume 1 identifies enhancing essential services as a focus for this budget. However, we know that, as acknowledged by the Department of Treasury and Finance in last year's Budget Paper number 1's fiscal strategy section, and I quote, "The greater the cost of the debt, the less funding available to provide direct services to the Tasmanian community." Something that is crystal clear in this budget is that our state will be burdened by an ever-increasing cost of debt across the forward estimates and well beyond. And it's clear too when you look at the expectations around spending on services, which falls off a cliff down the track so that we can pretend on paper that there'll be some magical surplus delivered in a few years' time. Utterly ridiculous. When you look at that, it's only possible because we have a crash in what we expect to spend on services. Mr. President, the 2 behemoth expenditure areas of our state budget are, of course, health and education, which comprise 56%, I think, of all government, general government sector expenditure. These are essential areas of government responsibility and investment for our community, and they're foundational. If we're not able to deliver adequate services in health and education, it's the future social and economic wellbeing of our state that is at risk. This budget makes it clear there will be falling government spending over the forward estimates. Falling government spending over the forward estimates. I think the member for Murchison highlighted in her contribution that, in fact, in 2028-29, we're forecast to spend 13% less than what we will spend in this current year. I don't believe there is ever a time we have actually decreased spending in key areas year to year. In fact, Mr President, this government takes great pride in continually crowing about its record spending in health and education. Well, one effect of this budget might mean that in a couple of years' time we won't have to listen to that anymore. As the member for Murchison said, what this budget is presenting in terms of falling expenditure, it sounds like an austerity approach. And we've certainly seen from other international jurisdictions that an austerity approach will fail in the long term, and not only that, it will do incredible damage along the way. In the area of health, Mr President, the AMA has stated this budget meets election promises but fails to deliver much more for existing services. The Department of Health needs to find $134.9 million in savings and efficiency dividend across its services. The budget provides for only a 1.7% increase in recurrent health funding from this financial year to the next, which is well below inflation and therefore represents even more of a cut on top of the required efficiency dividend. It's indisputable the Tasmanian health system is already struggling to meet demand. It simply cannot afford these cuts without dire consequences for the Tasmanian people. And Mr President, the area of education is similarly hit with cuts in this budget. It appears that $300 million in an efficiency dividend is to be found over the 4 years. However, of course, we have no detail on how that will be achieved or what supports we can expect to lose from our schools or from our education department to achieve this efficiency dividend. While there's $188 million for a school building blitz outlined in the budget, there's no sign that we're planning to address critical shortages that may be arising when we need to staff these new builds and these new developments in these schools. We can't just build things, Mr President, and then not adequately provide for the operation of the services that they are there to deliver. Just as our health workforce do an amazing job under intensely challenging conditions, we know that our teaching and educational support staff go far above and beyond what should be expected to ensure that Tasmanian children receive an education and are supported in their development throughout their childhood. It must be deeply disappointing for all public servants working in our essential services to see the trajectories of expenditure and cuts laid out in these budget papers. Quite frankly, Mr President, my heart goes out to them. Mr President, in better news...
I was just, while you were having a drink there...
I'll have another sip.
Have another sip. I'd just like to welcome to our chamber this afternoon students from Launceston College and St Patrick's College, who are the winners of the 2024 Parliamentary Debating Shield and Plate. Congratulations. We're currently noting the budget papers, yes, and honourable members of the Legislative Council get the opportunity to note and remark on the recent budget. And we'll move through that, and when that's over we'll be going on to the Industrial Hemp Amendment Bill for the second reading and process through committee stage if it gets through the second reading, and that's our orders of the day. So I'm sure all members will join me in congratulating you and making you most welcome to the Legislative Council today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. And I was just moving into something that was better news. when it comes to another of our central services, the community services industry. Because in this budget, the government has delivered on a commitment to an indexation approach, which goes some way to addressing cost increases. Indexation of 12.5% over 4 years, so that's comprised of 3.5% in 24-25 and then 3% for the remaining 3 years of the forward estimates, has been budgeted for. It's always an area of uncertainty for the sector. What the indexation rate will be, to have it mapped out is positive. However, TASCOS's comment is that they will now need to engage with the community sector organisations to understand what this indexation increase will deliver and whether it addresses the years of underfunding combined with increased demand and increased costs of doing business. And spoiler alert, Mr President, spoiler alert, it's guaranteed that while welcome and better than some years past, the indexation level in this budget will still leave essential community services desperately short of meeting current need, let alone providing for the increasing demand that they are experiencing now and over recent years. On a more positive note, I do understand there's a move by government to introduce 5-year funding agreements for the community services sector. This is definitely welcome and will provide additional continuity and security, especially in relation to recruiting and retaining staff. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that it's confirmed yet. Perhaps we'll find out in estimates next week. But that community services that are funded by the Department of Health will be similarly transitioned to that more sustainable 5-year funding agreement model. I hope they are, Mr President. It will be disappointing if we find that they aren't. There should be consistency. These are often services that work quite hand in glove and alongside each other out there in the community, whether they're funded regardless of which department they're funded from. So indexation, I think, should be something that is consistent and comprehensively applied across various government departments. Mr President, I attended the TASCOS post-budget briefing on Friday last week, which was an informative event and a valuable opportunity to speak with stakeholders in that sector and to hear the questions and concerns that they raised in relation to this budget. I listened to the Minister speak to the budget and the commitments it contains, and I was interested to hear, when he was speaking about community sector funding, that he reports the department are examining outcomes-based funding for the sector. Outcomes-based funding, Mr President, is a very positive model to consider and should generate more innovative approaches. However, I do recall it being looked at for this sector from at least a decade ago. Again, Mr President, what we have here is a question of deliverability and whether this government can actually do what it says it would like to do. Because I believe every minister in the intervening years from at least a decade ago has happily announced an intention to introduce an outcomes-based approach to funding the community services sector, and we've yet to see any actual progress delivering on that. You never know though, Mr President, we could remain optimistic and perhaps it will be 5th or 6th time lucky with the minister this time around. Mr President, any plan that does not place the climate emergency front and centre is barely worth the paper it's written on.
Hear, hear.
Climate justice is critical. We are already beginning to start to see comprehension dawn regarding some of the serious social challenges that the climate emergency poses for us, along with the potential devastation for our natural environment and biodiversity. This dawning comprehension is evident when people realise that incentives to move to electric cars, for example, while benefiting us environmentally, also risks benefiting those who can afford to transition to electric vehicles, and again leaving those who cannot afford with the polluting less cheap to run fossil fuel vehicles. Depending on potential incentive policy levers governments may wish to pull to further that transition, that could become a social equity issue. Another area is providing affordable housing in the climate sense of affordable. Climate emergency sensitive initiatives can be considerable climate justice equalisers or contribute to greater entrenched inequities, let alone when it comes to access to sustainable, clean, potable water, land and food to meet our ecological and biodiversity needs, as well as maintaining the health of our communities and our marine environments and so on. I read an interesting report recently detailing how schools across the US are ripping up playgrounds. This is driven by research showing that asphalt play areas, many of which were installed decades ago, magnify the health risks of extreme heat. Within cities, temperatures are typically hottest in dense, low-income neighbourhoods with little tree cover, where roads, buildings and parking lots soak up the sun's rays, known as urban heat island effect. These US studies have identified that schools in these lower socioeconomic areas tend to be even hotter because they have less shade and more asphalt. So climate change sends temperatures soaring. The movement to replace heat-absorbing pavement around the US schools has gained urgency, with more than 300 playgrounds across 23 states transforming asphalt playgrounds into islands of greenery. This example tells us much about not only how some jurisdictions are tackling the climate emergency, but also how those impacts could be felt more in some demographics than others. Addressing climate emergency in this regard can be an investment in social equity, whereas failure to do so will result in inequitable impacts, such as health impacts caused by heat in some of these poorer schools compared with wealthier suburbs, as identified by that US research. Closer to home, another example is the dawning realisation in the insurance sector, where people are being confronted with either rising premiums to insure their homes and property, through to insurance companies flat out refusing to cover them due to location and future extreme weather event projections. And again, the S-Lake Independent Review makes a salient point when it highlights on page 17 how, and I quote, "Surprisingly unremarked in Treasury's analysis of the Tasmanian economy presented in the 2023-24 budget papers, or the 2023-24 revised estimates report, has been the effects of persistent drought conditions on Tasmania's primary production sector, which accounts for almost 10% of Tasmania's economy, compared with less than 3% of Australia's." End of quote. This is potentially one example of where we need to be paying closer attention to climate change and its very real ramifications for a range of sectors, such as agriculture. And further, to touch again on my call for a comprehensive and urgent review of our revenue base and mix as part of structural reform, the impacts of climate change is and will continue to be one of those external pressures outside our control. We need to be clearly and consciously identifying and developing those policy parameters, settings and levers by which to ensure we're prioritising addressing climate change while also ensuring we deliver ecological and social climate justice. Being climate aware and investing in climate resilience and climate justice is so much more than renewable energy initiatives at the industrial scale or the establishment of renewable energy zones across maps. But there is little to indicate that when trawling through these budget papers. Mr. President, I wish to also touch briefly on the gender budget statement that came with this budget. Some members here will be aware that I, amongst others, have been calling for a comprehensive gender budget statement to be developed as part of the state budget process. In fact, we passed a motion in this place to that effect a few years ago, Mr. President, and that was when the government committed to begin including such a statement. So it was a very good response to a motion in this place. And I've been watching with interest how that initiative has developed across time, Mr. President. The current version in this budget is the third iteration, and as such I acknowledge there are marked improvements in it, which are really welcome. However, there is still a long way to go before it provides the comprehensive analysis required and can become the then useful tool as we would expect it to be. It's good to see the government has moved away from just listing its gender-based expenditure initiatives and instead has moved towards applying a gender-informed lens across potential policy positions and outcomes. A key area of improvement that we could look ahead to as we continue to develop this process, Mr. President, is the inclusion of intersectionality analysis as part of a multifaceted gender lens. And so to reiterate, while there's a definite improvement in approach and detail that's provided in this year's gender budget statement, it does need to continue to develop. If it can do that, Mr. President, it will become a useful public policy tool, not just a reporting tool after the fact, but actually a really good policy development tool for us to plan well for good public policy. It can become particularly a mechanism by which we can deliver greater inclusion and social and economic equity. Mr. President, I would take this opportunity to acknowledge some particular investments in this budget that will be very welcome in the electorate of Nelson. A significant one is the commitment to a Kingston Emergency Services Hub, which has $7.5 million allocated in 25-26 and the same in 26-27. This is a model that's been rolled out in some other areas already, and I'm sure the Kingston community and those other communities south of Kingston will be pleased to see this hub come to fruition. On the transport front, I note the commitment to develop a ferry terminal in Sandy Bay, which is a positive inclusion to the expansion of the Durant ferry service. I also hope in the not too distant future we'll be welcoming a similar announcement of a ferry terminal in Kingston, which would also be a very positive addition. Mr President, Gyra House is an incredibly important women's shelter in the Kingston area, and I'm pleased to see it receive some additional support of $150,000 in this budget. Like every women's shelter in this state, Gyra House experiences demand that far outstrips the accommodation and support available and has a huge turnaway rate. We know that many of those turned away are women and children trying to escape domestic violence, and the lack of crisis accommodation and then subsequently the lack of affordable longer-term accommodation is the biggest barrier to them successfully leaving and re-establishing a decent life. Mr President, Kingborough Community Missions provides extensive emergency food relief to the community, and under the leadership of Peter and Patricia Harvey does an incredible amount of good on a very small budget. It's positive to see additional support provided in this budget for this much appreciated grassroots organisation. And while it's a stone's throw beyond the Nelson boundary, I also note the $150,000 provided to the Blackmans Bay Hall, which is a facility valued by many Nelson constituents. As can be expected, Mr President, a range of sporting clubs in the Nelson electorate have received funding for projects to assist with their facilities. It includes the Kingborough Tigers Junior Football Club, the Kingston Crows Cricket Club, the Royal Yacht Club of Tasmania, Sandy Bay Sailing Club, Taroona Bowls and Community Club and Taroona Football Club. They are all welcome investments, Mr President. And in broad terms, I would hope that some of the additional funding that's committed in other areas of the budget, for example, to neighbourhood houses and to men's sheds, will also include a portion of additional assistance that flows through into the electorate of Nelson to the Kingston Neighbourhood House and the Kingston Men's Shed. Before I conclude, Mr President, I will also just mention, because it was covered so well by the member for Murchison, and I would like to back her calls and the concerns she raised around parliamentary resourcing in this budget, and reiterate that if we are to make this workplace a safe and respectful workplace, but also an efficient and effective workplace, we need to invest in that. And at this point in time, it does not look like that investment, as laid out in the budget, is either sufficient, and it's certainly not equitable across the two places here. And that's unacceptable, Mr President. It's particularly unacceptable for the staff associated with our chamber who aren't necessarily having the support funded for them in the same way that they are in the other place. And I also would back in the comments made by the member for Murchison around parliamentary resourcing for members, which also is now demonstrably inequitable across the two chambers. It feels gauche to speak about resourcing for us, Mr President. I know no one wants to hear politicians arguing for more staffing and resources for themselves. But that shouldn't be a reason that we have it go unremarked. That were I, for example, or others here, independent members of the other place, we would receive a staffing allocation under this budget of 2.5 FTEs, whereas here in this place as independents, we receive 1 FTE. That is strikingly inequitable when we are here trying to do an important job in this place as representatives for our community. In fact, if we think about it, Mr President, it's our communities that are being disrespected in expectation that we can undertake this important job with less resourcing, inequitable resourcing, compared to representatives from the other place. Before I close, Mr President, I'm just going to seek leave to table a document that I've referred to a lot in my contribution, which is the Independent Review of Tasmania State Finances by Mr Saul Eslake, dated August 2024. Although the document has been in the public domain since August, for some reason I believe it has not yet been tabled in either parliamentary chamber, despite it being an outcome of the Premier's previous formal agreement from April this year with the then 3 members of the JLN party. So I'll seek to table it now so that it becomes part of the record of this place.
The honourable member for Nelson seeks leave to table a document. The question is leave granted? Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
So with that, Mr President, to conclude, despite some sound key funding initiatives that are provided for in the State Budget 2024-25, in the main, it's hard to escape the fact that it is rooted in and perpetuates the short-term electoral cycle that we've now been stuck in for some time, and it utterly fails to put our state on an equitable, inclusive or sustainable footing. And on that note, I note the budget.